Well, I had planned to discuss Iran again today, but I have to say that I really need to take a break from that for at least one day because this whole situation in Belarus has really, been escalating this week, and I just hadn't had a chance to address it yet. So I think that before we get even further down the road with what's going on in Belarus, I need to stop and try to analyze all this. Now, obviously, the situation in Belarus has been developing for a very long time. For those of you who don't know, Belarus is considered to be the last dictatorship in Europe. It's actually a very interesting place. I wish I, was able to visit before they, before there's some kind of regime change there, because really, they have experienced the least amount of change since the fall of the Soviet Union. Belarus was, one of the, one of the many Soviet republics. In fact, along with Ukraine, it was two of the Soviet republics other than Russia that actually had seats in the UN that were separate, from the Soviet Union for some reason. And so historically, it was, one of the more important Soviet republics. And after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, things essentially, went on in Belarus as they always had. There was no, there wasn't the same sort of break in continuity with the government there. It was a pretty smooth transition. They just basically renamed well, it wasn't called the People's Republic. It would have been called the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic or something. They just renamed that Republic of Belarus, took the hammer and sickle off their flag and called it a day. Everything else pretty much stayed the same. The guys, the cops and the military still wear the same uniforms. The same guy is still in charge, Alexander Lukashenko. He was an old communist. But of course, you could say the same thing about Russia because, of course, Yeltsin was the president of Russia before the fall of the Soviet Union and after the fall of the Soviet Union. But, after the fall of the Soviet Union, certain Russian institutions were reformed, overhauled, created from scratch. For example, they separated the KGB into the FSB and the GRU, kind of like how the U.S. has the CIA and the FBI. They have a separate domestic and foreign intelligence service. In Belarus, it's still just the KGB, and I think they even call it the KGB. So yeah, it'd be a very interesting place to go. Other than, say, North Korea, it's probably the closest thing to a time capsule of the Cold War that we could experience. There hasn't been a ton of economic development in Belarus from what I understand. But from everything I've just said, you could probably guess that there's a lot of people in that country who are not too happy with the way things are, considering it's been almost 30 years now since the fall of the Soviet Union, and things haven't really improved much for them. They look at all of these other, former communist countries. They look at, let's say, Poland or Hungary, or maybe some of the more Western ex-communist countries, and they see, everything that's happened there and how they've developed, and they kind of feel like they're stuck still in the Cold War. And so there's been resentment against Lukashenko for a long time. Obviously, if you look at the election results for all the years that he's ran, and they've supposedly had presidential elections, it doesn't seem like it's the most realistic electoral system in the world. He gets very high levels of support. Then again, of course, so does Putin, and I think people generally consider Lukashenko to be more dictatorial and less democratic than Putin. And there have been protests against Lukashenko on election years in the past. People, waving the old non-Soviet Belarusian flag that was briefly used after World War I. And we're seeing this yet again, except it seems to be, it seems to have like the protests have a bit more potency this time around. Lukashenko seems quite worried. They are ongoing now for almost a week. The election was last Sunday. And Lukashenko, according to the results, got like 80%. Did he really win 80%? I would think it would probably be something lower than that. I don't know if he actually lost the election. Who knows? I mean, it's hard to say. I would think that in a country where, you don't really have freedom of speech, to say the least, and you have state-controlled media and a guy who's been around for 30 years, that, it should still be a pretty sure thing that he's going to get a majority of the votes, if only because a lot of the opposition would be scared into not voting. But, no matter what the details are, people generally think that this election was illegitimate. The European Union is taking this as an opportunity to try and sanction Belarus, and to, wag their finger at them and say, hey, we think that democracy is good and your dictatorship is bad. And lots of other countries are condemning Lukashenko and, essentially pressuring him to quit. And really, Lukashenko probably would have been forced out a very long time ago if it weren't for the support and the patronage of Putin. Belarus is the last, of the old Soviet republics that still remained loyal to Russia. I guess you could say Kazakhstan and maybe some of those other North Caucasus or Central Asian, I guess would be the right term, nations, because the North Caucasus, of course, would include Georgia. They're not exactly loyal to Russia, but for the most part, Belarus was the most notable, Russian ally. Of course, it is an actually European country, so some people might actually see it on a map. But, over the last couple of years, I've noticed that things do not seem to be so rosy between Russia and Belarus. I don't know the exact details, but Lukashenko was kind of, he seemed to be openly, differing from Putin when speaking publicly, and I didn't really know what that all was about. I'm not enough of an expert on Russo-Belarusian relations to analyze that, and so I never really tried. But I can tell you that there seem to have been differences, and right now, it would seem as though those differences are significant enough to where Putin might not be putting in such a strong effort to help Lukashenko, at least not as much as he once would have. I mean, one would think that after Putin, has lost all of his other allies in Georgia and Ukraine, that he would do everything he can to hang on to the last one here, Lukashenko. But I don't know that he will. Perhaps Putin just thinks that it's a lost cause at this point, because, of course, not only do the Western governments oppose Lukashenko, but he's been in there for so long that, perhaps, even Putin, doesn't think that he can credibly try and support him at this point. I think Putin probably feels that he doesn't want a Westerner in power in Belarus. He doesn't want a pro-Western government there, but he probably doesn't want to fight that hard to save Lukashenko either. He would rather have, somebody else who likes Putin and is not named Lukashenko. But frankly, I don't know if that's going to come about. But I do think that is a possibility, that they try and steal away a bit of this momentum that these protests have if Lukashenko is forced out, let's say by a military coup or something, or if he resigns and someone else from within his inner circle takes over and says, okay, we're going to move forward and we're going to set a timetable for reforms and stuff and just keep putting those reforms off. That would be a way that they could get out of this situation without, having to westernize. But obviously, what the West would like, and what Russia and Lukashenko probably would want to avoid, is a total free and fair election with money coming in from all sorts of different countries, so that the West could fund a candidate who is going to be aligned with their interests and will want to move towards joining the EU. Not that Belarus is anywhere near being economically able to enter the EU, but I think they'd be happy to have a situation in Belarus similar to that of Ukraine, to where you have a president in there who says nice things about the West. And I'm sure there are nonprofits and intelligence agencies on the ground trying to help organize these protests. It would be a gross oversight if Western intelligence and nonprofit groups were not doing that. The NGOs, I mean, this is the foundation, or not the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, the National Endowment for Democracy is the group I was trying to think of. I mean, this is what they exist for. It's to try and topple governments that the U.S. doesn't like and advocate for democratic elections to replace those governments. So I'm sure there's a lot of foreign interference going on here, but of course, just because there's foreign interference doesn't necessarily mean that there is no real resentment on the ground by the ordinary citizenry. Now, the latest thing I saw in this whole situation this morning was that apparently Lukashenko had sent some kind of cable or a letter or a phone call of some sort to Putin, essentially saying that, you know, hey, our fates are linked. If I fall, you're going to be next, buddy, and you don't want this domino to fall because you're the next domino to fall. If Belarus falls, well, then Russia is next. That's Lukashenko's message, saying, you know, hey, Domino Theory 101. Please save me, Daddy Vlad. And I think Lukashenko makes a very fair point there. Of course, it's obviously very self-interested. He wants Putin to come save him, and I don't really know what Putin could do to save him at this point. But it is true that you know, if Lukashenko is to fall, well, then obviously, you know, Putin would be the only one left on the list. And Russia has always had a political, you know, sort of a foreign policy of trying to manage their frontiers. Russia is a country with a very long and, you know, somewhat indefensible border. And so the way that, you know, that Russia historically, even before the Soviet Union, before Putin, has defended itself is by acquiring these sort of peripheral states and setting up pro-Russian governments there to serve as buffers to the Russian motherland. And so Lukashenko, in his appeal to Putin, is appealing to a very basic instinct of Russian leaders. And so even if Putin is not a fan of Lukashenko himself, perhaps he will try and orchestrate a transition of power to someone other than Lukashenko, who is also, you know, a friend of the cause as far as the anti-Western alliance is concerned. That, to me, other than Putin doing nothing, those seem like the only two options. Because, of course, Putin might do nothing and Lukashenko could ride out the storm just fine. You know, it's not like there's any armed insurrection in the streets of Minsk trying to take the Capitol building or something like that. These are just people waving flags in the streets. It's a lot of people. It's apparently tens of thousands according to Reuters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a government is going to fall. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.